The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Bill Betancourt with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and welcome to today's Get Real National Network webinar. Before we get started, a few logistical things to consider. We always give you a little spiel, so some of you have heard this before. In order to include the best quality sound we can, we ask you call in from a landline. Do not use a speakerphone if possible. Avoid using cellular or cordless phones because it causes background problems. If you have problems with sound quality, it can often be resolved by hanging up and calling back in. We're recording this webinar, as we do all of our webinars, and they will be posted on our website, getrealnetwork.uic.edu, and sent out to all network members. During the webinar, please send in questions as you have them using the chat function. We're going to collect the questions, and we will, at the end of the webinar, have a question and answer session. After the webinar, we will send out a follow-up email with a survey, a brief survey, and we do ask please to respond. It really helps us as we continue to develop our webinar series. So today's presenter is Cheryl Staats, who is a senior researcher at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. Her current work focuses on the implicit racial ethnic bias. She's the author of the State of Science Implicit Bias Review, an extensive annual publication that synthesizes a broad range of scholarly literature on how unconscious racial associations influence human decision-making and outcomes. Cheryl leads a portfolio of race and cognition work that explores implicit bias across a range of domains, including healthcare, criminal justice, employment, and education. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for having me today. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to join you and share some information related to implicit bias. As many of you know, implicit bias really is kind of a hot topic right now. The science has been around for a while. It's certainly still growing and developing. But we're really beginning to see the words implicit bias or unconscious bias increasingly permeate the mainstream media, public discourse, especially over the past couple of years. So while this research continues to grow and develop, evidence would certainly suggest that it's going to continue to be a major area of interest for people across a range of different professions and domains for this foreseeable future. So I imagine many folks have heard about the concept, so my major goal today is to help people really more fully understand it. So in terms of just today's conversation and the major goals, I'm going to start off by providing a very brief background about the Kirwan Institute, just to provide a little bit context about in terms of how our interest in this research field emerged, and also talk a little bit about some of our contributions to the research field. After that, I'm going to go through a pretty thorough introduction to the science of implicit bias in terms of how this concept operates, what it means in terms of real-world outcomes. My focus here today is largely going to be on cognition, in terms of how our brains work to help process the world, and specifically in terms of the role of some of those unconscious associations play in our cognitive processing. From there, I'm going to move a little bit into a subsection on the Implicit Association Test. That's one of the most commonly used tools to assess these kind of unconscious dynamics. And I'm going to share a little bit about the logic that undergirds this assessment, as well as provide some examples of the types of findings that it has uncovered over years of research and use. After that, I'm going to move into a section that's going to tie some of these ideas and findings together into some of the populations that are of interest to this audience. I'll talk about implicit bias findings as they relate to implicit attitudes related to sexual orientation, and also talk about a little bit some of the findings as it relates to youth. This is going to be just a taste of this body of research, basically an introduction. And then at the end, I'm going to close by talking about how can we guard against letting some of these implicit biases affect our interactions with other individuals. So to start off, just a little bit about the Kirwan Institute. As Bill said, we're located at The Ohio State University. We're founded in 2003, and the name Kirwan Institute comes after a former OSU president, William Britt Kirwan, who really championed diversity and he's now with the University System of Maryland. Our executive director is Professor Sarah Debias, and she's a professor at the Moritz College of Law. In our work here at the Kirwan Institute, we really focus on the needs of racially marginalized populations at a time of incredibly rapidly growing diversity throughout our nation and our local community. The Kirwan Institute is actually one of the largest race-focused research institutes in the U.S. We're very much interdisciplinary in terms of our approach. My personal background is in sociology, but I work side by side every day with people that are from city and regional planning, lawyers, health policy folks, public policy, geographers, so on and so forth. So we really bring a variety of different lenses to our work, and it really creates a unique atmosphere in terms of the outcomes and products that we produce. And we're not just an applied research institute, we also tend to think of ourselves as an engaged research institute. The work that we do is very much directly connected to the communities we serve. We're really seeking to actively understand and solve problems in society. So as such, we work with a lot of on-the-ground organizations and entities, providing them the data and the research support they need to do the work that they do in the most effective and most equitable way possible. Our interest in implicit bias stems largely from our model, and our mission statement is to create a just and inclusive society where all people and communities have opportunity to succeed. And opportunity really is the key word that drives the work of the Kirwan Institute. We conceptualize this very broadly. So opportunity can be something like having opportunity to have a good education. Do you have opportunity to have access to transportation, healthcare, things of that nature? So as you see in the diagram on the left, we're currently working in what we would consider to be 4 opportunity domains, the red circles being education, equity and sustainable communities, public and community health, as well as criminal justice. And when we think about opportunity, we really started to develop an interest in implicit bias when we think about it in terms of what barriers exist in our society that can impede people's access to opportunity. And the 2 that we really centrally focus on and identified is kind of the outer gray circles that you see in the diagram. We recognize the role of structural arrangements and how those arrangements can create barriers to opportunity. And then the second one is the race and cognition area where I work, really thinking about how the cognitive forces, our mental processing, especially as it pertains to race, how it can serve as a barrier to this kind of opportunity. And this is kind of the heart and soul of the work that I do. So in terms of the Kirwan Institute, just very briefly, the how we do what we do part of it, it sort of falls in 3 main camps that you see shown on the left there. We're really actively engaged and involved in our community in a variety of different levels. We help a lot of folks with data-driven decision making. We're also active as teachers and trainers and whatnot. So as Bill mentioned, my work falls into race and cognition, specifically implicit bias, and for the most part, implicit racial bias. I'm not going to talk as much specifically about race today, because I know that's not necessarily the primary interest of this audience, but it really is kind of the heart and soul of my day-to-day work here at Kirwan. We have a few major publications that have really helped cement our positioning in the field in terms of being a resource for implicit bias knowledge. And the major publication that has really set us in this position is what's called the State of the Science Implicit Bias Review. We currently have 2 editions out, the 2013 and 2014, and the 2015 edition of it is actually headed to print here very shortly. Now what these are basically are major scans of the literature. What do we know about this field? And at the same time, what are the gaps? What are the areas of knowledge that we need to grow and expand in order to really understand these dynamics as fully as possible across as many domains as possible? So at the bottom there, the 2013 inaugural edition provided a lot of background in terms of the history of implicit bias, how it came to be, how we came to measure it, and then focused on 3 real substantive domains, the education, criminal justice, and the health and healthcare domain. And that edition also includes a really extensive discussion of debiasing. The next year, the 2014 edition, updated all the literature that was released in the previous year. So as an annual publication, we're literally keeping tabs on the field as the literature is released, summarizing it, contextualizing it, and sharing these new contributions to the field in a really accessible manner. In the 2014 edition, we also tracked 2 more specific fields. We looked at it in terms of employment, and we looked at implicit bias in terms of its dynamics with respect to housing. And so as a result of the State of Science, it's really positioned Kirwan sort of as an intermediary between the implicit bias scholarship and a variety of different audiences. And a lot of our goals involve just making this really rich research accessible, take it out of some of that kind of scholarly language that can be difficult to get through and provide it to people in a very plain language that helps them understand the world that they live in and affect change in the world that they live in. Outside of this data science, the Kirwan Institute is also involved in several different projects involving original research with respect to implicit bias. Our two most recent areas there have been in school discipline, and has also been looking at it in terms of academic medicine and healthcare. So with that background, I want to start providing a little bit of background on implicit bias. I want to begin just very simply with the definition. When we're talking about implicit bias, we're talking about either attitudes or stereotypes and how they affect our understandings, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And when you break this down, the really key word that's most important is talking about unconscious or implicit. We're talking about biases and associations that are activated unconsciously, meaning that people are unaware of them, but these biases are still implicitly influencing our perceptions, our behaviors, our decisions, and whatnot. Generally speaking, across the literature, implicit bias and unconscious bias are generally regarded as basically the same idea. Same thing for implicit social cognition. I tend to use the word implicit bias, so you'll probably hear that from me most often, but just so you know, when you hear implicit bias or unconscious bias, we're talking about the same dynamics. When we're talking about implicit bias, what we're really talking about is mental associations that exist outside of our awareness. It's outside of our intentional control. These things are automatically activated. They're very much involuntary in our part. And another unique attribute about them is they're not accessible through introspection. I mean, we're literally talking about unconscious being outside of our awareness in the sense of it's not something that we can perceive through reflection. We can't sit there and say, I wonder what my implicit biases are. It's much, much deeper ingrained in our unconscious. So when we think about this implicit bias concept as a whole, what we're basically saying is that we unconsciously harbor favorable and unfavorable associations. And that really is what a bias is. I want to take just a moment and talk about the word bias, because it's certainly one that has certain connotations with it. But when we think about bias in a very literal sense, we're really just talking about a favorable or unfavorable assessment. Usually bias is perceived as having a negative connotation, but it's important to remember that it's not inherently a negative term. We can also have positive biases about things. When we think about implicit bias, I also want to make the point that they can be activated, when you're talking about them in terms of people, they can be activated on any number of different identities that we perceive in others. So certainly across race, ethnicity, age, appearance, religion, ability, so on and so forth. Lots of different facets to this topic. So if we want to understand how implicit biases operate, we need a little bit of understanding and background in terms of how our minds function. Particularly the unconscious aspects of our cognition that gives rise to these implicit biases. And the basic question here is, so what's going on in our unconscious minds? And the short answer is that there's a tremendous amount going on. I imagine that most of you have seen iceberg analogies like this before, wherein a portion of the iceberg that's above the water is merely a fraction of the overall size of the iceberg. You can very much make a similar distinction with respect to the portion of our cognitive processing that is conscious, which is the portion that's above the water, as opposed to the unconscious, which really is that much larger underwater portion. If some of you may be familiar with a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, and in it he delineates two systems of thought relating to these conscious and unconscious mental processes. The first one is System 1, and System 1 is the portion of the iceberg that's beneath the water. When we talk about System 1 thinking, we're talking about this automatic, effortless processing that occurs very, very quickly. We use it automatically to construct a coherent interpretation of the world around us in a given instant. It's no conscious effort, no voluntary control. And the key idea here, the key quality of this unconscious processing is associative memory, meaning that we often our mental cognition is focused on these associations that we carry with us. That's how it's able to work so quickly, as it's connecting ideas almost effortlessly in an associative fashion. On the flip side, when you're looking above the iceberg, System 2. And System 2 is very slow. It's the deliberate, effortful, orderly part of our thinking. It's the attention that we bring to our processes that really involve the most mental effort and cognition. Most of us tend to think, after reaching a certain age of adulthood, that these System 2 attributes are how we function in the world, that we're logical, we're orderly. We want to think of ourselves as being rational thinkers, of course. But the reality is, as the iceberg shows, that the majority of our cognition is that System 1 that's actually occurring at an unconscious level. Just to give a little bit of more example here, to put some numbers on this, neuroscientists have actually estimated that the human brain can process 11 million pieces of information each second. But we're only consciously aware of a fraction of that data, maybe as little as 40. Some estimates actually have that number as little as 16 bits out of 11 million every second. So when we expand this iceberg analogy further, some people go so far to say is that it's not that there's a portion of the iceberg that's above the water. If we want to make this analogy accurate, it's more like there's this little bitty snowball that's above the water, and literally the rest of our cognition is residing in these unconscious realm. So with so much going on and so much data and information that's inundating us every second, the reality is we don't have the mental processes, mental capacity, if you will, to consciously process all of it. We can only consciously process a portion of it. So much of this is occurring outside of our conscious awareness. So I want to go through a couple of examples just to give you a sense of how our unconscious processing is so quick and so easy. So take a look at this sentence. Now think about it for a moment. Every single word of that sentence, except for I and was, is misspelled. Yet I have complete confidence that you were all able to read it relatively effortlessly. How is this possible? You clearly were not sitting there consciously putting effort into decoding the words and using effortful processing to rearrange the letters. This is an example of how your unconscious mind is doing the work. But maybe this example was just too easy, so let's try another one, and I'll pause to give you a moment. So let's think about this. How are you able to read this jumbled text? You can read it because your brain is taking what you see consciously, processing it in the background unconsciously, matching these jumbled words with the words that you already know, and sending back the different coherent message. This processing is occurring very quickly. It's occurring outside of your conscious awareness. It's a great example of your System 1 thinking at work. This is not something that's involving conscious mental effort, but nevertheless clearly is a function that is at work. This kind of unconscious cognition is incredibly important to how our minds function. It's very quick, it's very easy. So I want to try another example just to give you another sense of how quickly our minds can process some things using that System 1, and then conversely contrast it with something that requires more effort, more of a System 2 type conscious processing. So what you're going to see on the left is going to be a column of words, 11 lines long. And each text, the text in each of the rows has a different color. It's a different font color. So as the arrows, I'm going to have an arrow next to it. I'm just going to scroll the arrow down next to the words. And I want you to either say to yourself or say aloud if you can, the color of each line of text. So I'm interested in what the font color is. And I want to apologize in advance if anybody happens to be colorblind for this exercise. So here we go. Okay. Now we're going to do the exact same thing on the right-hand side of the slide. Again, I want you to either say to yourself or say aloud if you can, the color of the font as it scrolls by. Here we go. Now let's stop and talk about this for a moment. First of all, the arrows were moving down the screen at the exact same speed, just to be clear on that. This is an example of what's known as the Stroop test. It's a psychology test. And basically the idea here is that for most people, completing the task in that left-hand side column was quite easy. You have a very strong association that's built and been reiterated over and over since you were a very, very young child that mentally associates color words with their corresponding colors. This isn't something that you're consciously thinking about. I imagine that nobody sat there and actually consciously processed what they were doing in that left-hand column. The answer just pops in your head automatically. This is your System 1 unconscious processing at work. But conversely, on the right-hand side, when I ask you to make a new, different association, it was probably much more difficult. For most people, it takes them much longer to get through the font color list on the right, and more often they typically make more mistakes when they try and do so. What you're experiencing there basically is the tension between System 1 and System 2 processing. Your quick thinking unconscious System 1, it thought it knew the answers quick and easy. It felt like, oh yeah, I got these color associations, no big deal. But your System 2 processing realized, oh wait a minute, this isn't what I think it is. I have to actually put some effort into processing these in order to be able to say aloud the appropriate font color. So the point here is, besides the tension between System 1 and System 2, which hopefully you felt and experienced, it also makes a new point about your brain when it tries to make different associations. When you tried to make those associations on the right that were new and unfamiliar, it probably took you longer. You probably made more mistakes. This notion that objects and ideas that are closely associated are much easier to mentally process versus unfamiliar associations that take longer to process really is a central key idea underlying the Implicit Association Test, which is one of the most popular, sophisticated, and recognizable tests of implicit bias. And I'll talk about that more here in a minute. But a couple points before we proceed. In terms of the dynamics of implicit bias, with so much of our conscious processing in our cognition, with so much of our cognition relying on this unconscious processing and that use of associations, these unconscious implicit biases that we have are very pervasive and very robust. Absolutely everybody is susceptible to implicit biases. This includes people who believe themselves to be impartial or objective. I mean, implicit biases have been assessed in judges, people who make their living with the idea of being impartial. Studies have also shown that even people who really truly believe themselves and their interactions to be egalitarian, people that deliberately work to behave without prejudice or biases, can still hold and exhibit implicit biases. These unconscious biases, because we have them, they can affect our behaviors in ways that we might not explicitly endorse, but nevertheless have real-world outcomes that matter. And the final point there, which I won't go into too much, but there is good news out at the end of this, is the fact that these implicit associations that we have are malleable. Even though the associations tend to be quite ingrained, they can be changed. It's a process that involves time and effort, but it is possible. So if you think of the Stroop test we just did, if you spend enough time studying those words in the right-hand column, ultimately at some point you could rebuild your associations so that the color and color word associations are different than the ones you currently have. Certainly wouldn't be an easy task. It would certainly take a lot of time, but nevertheless it's something that would be possible. So where do these implicit biases come from? I want to take just a moment to think about the System 1 associations as they relate to people. These implicit associations that we harbor unconsciously cause us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on characteristics we perceive in them. And they're really developed over the course of a lifetime, beginning at very, very young ages. Usually the major conclusion the researchers have come to is that it's a matter of the direct and indirect messages that we've been exposed to throughout the course of our lifetimes. Everything from TV and movies and music and books and people and so on and so forth. And the important point here is that these messages about various groups may be distorted. It's not necessarily that the messages are accurate at all or reflect a group accurately, but when they're reinforced repeatedly over time, we begin to internalize them unconsciously. So when we think about why are these unconscious dynamics important, there's a few points that emerge. Part of why there's so much interest in this unconscious cognition is the fact that the credibility of biased self-reports increasingly was being questioned in the literature. So more and more calls came for the use of these indirect measures, finding unobtrusive ways to accurately capture attitudes. Reasons why that these explicit self-reports can be questionable fall in two categories. There's this whole notion of the fact that in many cases we're not willing to share our true perspectives. Our self-reports may be tainted by social desirability concerns, interest in conforming to what's regarded as quote-unquote socially acceptable. There's also just this inclination of impression management. especially when the topic at hand might be particularly politically or socially sensitive. On the flip side, the other part of the conversation is that sometimes we just aren't able to share our true perspectives. We're generally weak at introspection, and that makes us sometimes unaware of the biases that we carry. The explicit measures, such as self-reports, can only reflect the portion of what we believe to be true about ourselves, but that can be an incomplete assessment because so many unconscious associations may be at play. Another notable point that really stands out that I want to emphasize is that some research actually suggests that implicit attitudes may be better at predicting and influencing behavior than those self-reported explicit attitudes. So no matter how strongly we explicitly feel about a specific topic, the soapbox that we would choose to stand on, if you will, the reality is that it's the unconscious associations that we carry with us a lot of times are the things that are really better predictors and more strong influencers of our actual behaviors. So in terms of why else this is important, a major point is that I'm starting to get at here is that our conscious explicit beliefs do not necessarily align with our implicit preferences. These are related concepts, but they're distinct, primarily on that different level of awareness that we've been talking about. Our explicit biases are the ones we consciously detect. These are things that we can report, we can talk about, we could list or acknowledge them if we wanted to. But when we're talking about these implicit biases, they're arising outside of this conscious awareness. They don't necessarily align with our openly held stances. The things that we would publicly profess are not necessarily the same. So I pulled a little bit of data here just to give you a sense of some of these numbers. This data isn't necessarily generalizable to a national level or whatnot, but it does paint a picture of how our implicit and explicit attitudes can differ. So for example, if you look at the lines towards the top with the race data, the majority of folks, when they're comparing blacks and whites or Asians and whites, explicitly stated that they were neutral. They're around 56–57% each. But when you look over to the right-hand side and look at the implicit assessments that people provided, the percentage that were neutral was actually much lower, and higher level bias was found for folks that were implicitly favoring whites, that far right column. And a similar phenomenon shows for sexual orientation. If you look at the bottom, especially in the bottom left, that respondents were largely split between being neutral in terms of neutral and favoring straight people on the explicit measures. But if you move over to the right and look at that implicit assessment, it really showed much higher percentages of folks implicitly favoring straight people. So again, when we think about these kinds of research findings in light of the real-world outcomes and whatnot, and thinking about it in terms of these implicit attitudes being better predictors of some of our behaviors, this dissociation between explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes really becomes particularly notable and frankly quite powerful. So I want to spend just a few moments talking about the implicit association test in terms of how do we actually assess some of the biases, implicit biases that we carry with us. The implicit association test is one of the most popular, sophisticated, and recognizable tests of implicit bias. It was pioneered by Dr. Anthony Greenwald and some of his colleagues in 1998. And basically, it's a computer-based test, and it measures the relative strength of association between different pairs of concepts. It's basically asking you to play a matching game, which I'll show you a little bit in the next slide, where you're asked to make different pairs. And when you're sorting these concepts, what it's doing is measuring the time differences between schema-consistent pairs and schema-inconsistent pairs. So when two concepts are highly associated, this sorting task is much easier. It takes less time to complete than when the concepts are not as highly associated. Again, think of this in terms of the Stroop test with those two different color words in the columns. One was much easier than the other because those associations are just much more automatic, more highly associated. And this difference in mean response latency is what's known as the IAT effect. So the website for the implicit association test is the bottom, and I really, really want to strongly encourage you to take the opportunity to take some of these implicit association tests. As I said, it's a matching game, and each one has several different sets of trials where it asks you to make different pairings. So I've pulled just a few screenshots from the Sexuality IAT just to give you a sense of how the test is structured. You're asked to do a variety of different matching tasks where you have computer buttons assigned to the left and right, and the target object that you're needing to put in a category is the object that appears in the middle. So for example, on the first one you see in the upper left would be asking you to sort images of gay people and straight people. So the prompt that you see there for the two male figures, you would push the button that corresponds to the right-hand category. Other trials just simply involve words. So you're looking at the screenshot there in the upper right being an example of this. They have a collection of words that would be considered good words, words like kindness and pleasant and glorious and whatnot. And then there's words of quote-unquote, a collection of quote-unquote bad words, so things like disease and nasty and sad and whatnot. And you'd be asked to place the target word in the middle in the appropriate category. But then when you look down to the bottom two trials, what they're doing is assigning multiple attributes to each category. So for example, on the bottom left, you have both gay people and these bad negative words going to the left, and straight people, or these positive good words, going to the right. And then the screenshot in the bottom right gives you a sense of that other pairing. This test is incredibly, incredibly sensitive, and these time differences are measured in milliseconds. And what the research shows is that these time differentials of these IAT effects are a measure of implicit biases. It's been a tremendous body of research been devoted to this implicit association test, showing that the IAT effect is a true measure of implicit bias. It's statistically significant. This is not just due to random chance. It's been really intensely studied, lots of reliability tests, lots of validity tests, and generally speaking, it has withstood all of these scrutiny tremendously well. So you take the test, and at the end, the results give you a sense of whether you have a strong, moderate, slight, or no preference for a given group as opposed to another group. So there's several different types of IATs available. I've just put in a few of them on the screen. They generally fall into two camps. The attitude ones that are looking at concept and valence association. So basically, do you have attractiveness to or an aversion from, using those positive or negative words and different aspects of individuals' identities. And then on the right-hand side, there are a body of tests that involve stereotypes, so group trait associations, looking at different groups and the extent to which certain characteristics are or are not associated with them. So while there's not a whole tremendous amount of LGBT research related to implicit bias, I did want to pull in several different studies that I did find. So the first thing I want to show you is the IAT results that were released from Project Implicit with respect to the gay-straight IAT. What you're looking at here is data from almost 270,000 people who have taken this test. This is data from February of 2002 to May of 2006. And each category is showing automatic implicit preference for one group as opposed to the other. So for example, the first line would read that 3% of people showed a strong preference for gay people as opposed to straight people. The color categories there, the blue categories are the ones showing implicit preferences to various degrees for gay people. The orange category is neutral, and the green category are those that are showing implicit preferences for straight people to those varying degrees shown. As you see clearly, the bulk of participants' IAT responses falls in those green categories. 48% is falling in those. But you need to remember that these are just implicit preferences. They don't necessarily align with individuals' explicit beliefs. Another strain of research that's particularly interesting is the fact that researchers showing that members of specific demographic groups can actually internalize negative associations about their own groups. Regardless of what explicit biases we may have, we can still internalize a lot of these direct and indirect messages that we've received that can lead us to have anti-in-group bias. So for example, I could be a female mathematician, believe very strongly in the value of women in the field of math, but at the same time, I could still implicitly associate males more quickly with math as opposed to females, just because that message and that narrative is something that's so very common. So generally speaking, the research suggests that we tend to implicitly favor our own group, affording them some degree of trust automatically. I looked at a variety of different sources trying to get some data for the implicit biases related to sexual orientation, especially looking at this in terms of this notion of anti-in-group bias. And the results really were quite mixed. The research team at Project Implicit, which is the group behind the Implicit Association Test, had this to say. They said that the IAT results consistently show that members of stigmatized groups, whether we're talking about gay people, older people, so on and so forth, quote, tend to have more positive implicit attitudes towards their groups than do people who are not in the group, but there is still a moderate preference for the more socially valued group. So while gay people tend to show an implicit preference for straight people relative to gay people, it's not as strong as the implicit preference that generally is shown by straight people, end quote. So the explanation offered here very simply is that what we would consider to be a stigmatized group member, again using the language of the Implicit Association Test people, those folks tend to develop negative associations about their group based on the cultural environment that they live in. But at the same time, they still have some positive associations based on their own group membership and the group membership of those that they are close to. So I looked a little bit further into other research trying to understand this anti-in-group implicit bias as it emerges. And a few different points I want to raise. Some 2004 work by William A. Jellison and colleagues, they studied the implicit sexual orientation attitudes among both gay and straight men. They found that both groups had a very strong implicit in-group bias. Another study came out in 2013 by Anselini and colleagues. They studied male and female Italian respondents, and these respondents were either straight, gay, or bisexual. Now that they found for straight and bisexual respondents, both of those categories tended to implicitly prefer straight over gay, while the gay respondents implicitly preferred gay over straight. They actually broke this down a little bit further, trying to understand what dynamics might be contributing to this. So for example, for straight respondents, they saw that strong in-group preference that the straight respondents held was driven largely by positive associations with straight, but not necessarily because they had negative associations with the concept of gay. The gay respondents, their favoring of gay over straight really kind of came out neutral. They weren't necessarily driven very strongly by either positive or negative associations for either group. And on the bisexual respondents, they found that their preference for straight was largely driven by the attribution of negative respondents about gays, rather than positive traits about straight people. So again, there's a lot to unpack here, but we really want to think about the implicit association test. It's a relative measure. So there is sort of a back and forthness to it of, well, you favor this group, but you're favoring it in light of a contrasting group. In the final study there at the bottom, Hatzenbuehler and colleagues, 2009, it was a smaller sample, but it did focus more on young adults. The mean age of their sample was 21. And they looked at LGBT respondents. And what they found is that while LGBT respondents held positive implicit attitudes towards gays and lesbians overall, these attitudes did not differ significantly from zero. So it really was a situation in which there kind of was an absence of in-group bias. It was relatively a neutral outcome. So again, this is just a taste of the literature, but I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the conversations that are going on in this realm with respect to the implicit association test. Another question that emerges from this kind of work, and also in light of some of the populations that I know are central to the work you do, is thinking about age, and how does age contribute to some of these dynamics. The sample size you're looking at here is very large. It's nearly 270,000 people. The authors do say it's not necessarily a representative sample of any definable population, but nevertheless it really is quite a large span of folks. And again, this is data from roughly early 2002 to the middle of 2006. The ages are grouped by decades across the x-axis, and all folks that are 60 and older were collapsed into that final category on the far right. And the y-axis, what you need to know there is that if the score was positive, the score is indicating a preference for straight people compared to gay people. So as you see, all the values are positive, so it's suggestive of that relationship, the preference for straight compared to gay. Looking across the age groups, the findings here, I mean, clearly there is a dynamic going on in which across all the age groups, there's an implicit preference for straight over gay that is higher than what the participants explicitly expressed. So again, the blue bars are showing what they believe, what their implicit attitudes are, and the red bars are showing that explicit attitudes, those self-reports. There is some subtle variation in terms of those gaps across the different age groups. I do want to note, again, this data, they finished capturing it in May of 2006, so it is a little bit outdated, even though it's the most recent I could find. But I would certainly suggest, so just be suspecting that as attitudes continue to evolve over time, especially with respect to gay rights and whatnot, I imagine that this curve would skew a little bit differently to some extent for now. And I also want you to keep in mind that this is not a life course progression of biases, but rather it's just a snapshot in time for people of various ages. It really is an area that is in need of tremendous amount of more research. I also wanted to make you aware of an initiative launched by MTV in April of 2014. And the Kirwan Institute served as a partner for this effort, along with a lot of other really great organizations. And it's a Look Different campaign, and it's aimed at millennial population. Basically, the campaign objectives is understanding that we all have biases of different types, and it's helping give millennials the permission, the vocabulary, and a space to really explore these issues, helping them identify hurtful biases and giving them the knowledge that they need for how can they effectively respond when they see or experience these kind of biases. They're operating, basically the campaign was launched under this premise that millennials widely believed to be the most tolerant generation, the most diverse generation that we've seen in history. But at the same time, discrimination based on race, gender, and sexual orientation is increasingly becoming more subtle. And young people are really not necessarily having all of the tools and the faculties that they need to effectively discuss and fight back against these biases. So it's a three-part campaign in terms of race, gender, and anti-LGBT biases. And the campaign focuses both on the implicit and explicit attitudes. And it's a 3-year campaign, and if you get an opportunity, I really do encourage you just to take a moment and check out the website. It's a really dynamic website, lots of really great interactive features. They even have an implicit association test on there that was specifically designed for millennials. So I wanted to bring that to your attention because it may be of interest to you, or it may be of interest to some of the youth that you work with. So moving into the last section here, I just want to spend a few moments talking about how can we guard against implicit bias? How can we guard against this influence in our day-to-day life? First and foremost, step number one, without a doubt, is that you need to know your own implicit biases. It's incredibly important to be aware of any of the discrepancies that may exist between your own conscious ideals and any of those non-conscious automatic biases that you're carrying around with you. These implicit associations cut across all sorts of identity categories. So it's possible that you may not have biases with respect to some categories, but at the same time, perhaps another attribute is something that you carry biases towards. So I really would encourage you, again, to take the implicit association test. The website's there. It's 10 minutes, and it's really just a fascinating and truly enlightening experience. Having said that, I want to raise the point that while awareness is awesome, it really isn't necessarily enough. When we know about these discrepancies that exist between our conscious ideals and any of these non-conscious, automatic, implicit biases that we carry, that knowledge is not alone. Alone is not enough to really remove or overcome or dismantle the effects of these implicit biases on our decision-making. Similarly, ignoring our biases or denying them is not effective. A lot of people really get that sense when they get implicit association tests back. Might really just be to want to repress these biased thoughts. Say, okay, fine, maybe I have this bias, but I'm just going to keep that back. I'm not going to let it affect my life. It's not going to affect or influence my decisions. And really the research feels pretty strongly about this. This notion has not been supported in the literature because of what is known as rebound effects. Basically the idea here is that the more we try and suppress these automatic associations and stereotypes, we're not reducing them, but we're actually amplifying them because they're becoming more hyper-accessible in our minds. Something to think about. Beyond just this awareness piece, it's really important to have a sense of when you might be susceptible. What kind of conditions can lead to the reliance on implicit biases? When are those times when that system 1 is most likely to be active and not the system 2 thinking? The research has a few different areas that I just wanted to bring forth briefly. First of all, in any situations where the information is ambiguous or incomplete, our brains are very likely to rely on those pre-existing schemas and associations to fill in the gaps, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. It's those system 1 automatic associations are the ones that we're most likely to draw to mind when the information we have is incomplete. Along a similar point, whenever you're under a time constraint, because System 1 is so quick and it's so easy and such simple processing for our brain to do, that's going to be the default mode. That's what we're more likely to rely upon, is those implicit associations. And the last point there on this slide, it's also a matter of when is our cognitive control compromised? When we have a lot on our minds, a really high cognitive load, or situations perhaps when there's fatigue. The implicit bias research indicates that, again, because System 1 is so fast and so easy, when our brains get bogged down for any number of reasons, it's more likely to take that quick and easy default route, and that's going to be that System 1 processing that has the unconscious associations. I also want to take a moment and just talk a little bit about mindfulness. When we're thinking about our cognitive load at any given point in life, I think most of us feel very much like we identify with the thought bubble on the left. So have the 1,001 things on our mind, and we're all trying to deal with this all at once, much less like the thought bubble on the right. But being mindful of the moment actually can be a great way to help address and debias folks. Having that mindset to try and meet each moment fully. It gives us an opportunity to see things more clearly, and it helps slow us down from that really quick System 1 processing to the more deliberate and slower System 2 processing. So an example of this is kind of a mindfulness exercise, if you will. If you're about to make a decision or whatnot, just stop and say, if the person in front of me was different in some way, they were a different race, different age, different gender, different sexual orientation, what have you, if that person in front of me was different somehow, would I be making the same decision, or I would be making a different decision? We really need to think about these moments as an opportunity to move away from that System 1 and move towards the System 2. We need to be cognizant of when our minds are more like that left thought bubble, and know that in those moments, that's when our minds are particularly susceptible to implicit biases. And the final point here, we're talking about guarding against bias, is the fact that beyond being aware of your biases, it's important that you take actions to actually address them. But basically, the central idea here is this notion almost of reprogramming your brain. That is, if these existing associations are there, how can we go about creating new associations? And how can we make those new associations chronically accessible so that when the next time the scenario comes up, that new association, the one that I desire, is the first one that comes to mind, and not perhaps the implicit association that we carried in the past. A couple strategies for doing so that are really common in the literature. One of them is talking about intergroup contact. And certainly the more you get to know a variety of different people, wide level of diversity of backgrounds and whatnot, on a real, true personal level, people that differ from you in some way, those create opportunities for reprogramming some of those pre-existing associations. It's an opportunity also to kind of break down some of those other existing associations as well. Intergroup contact is particularly good, but it also has certain conditions for success. It really is important that the two individuals that are involved in the process are of equal status. So for example, you're going to have much better debiasing success when it's between two adults or between two kids, but not as much in terms of a child or an adult relationship. It also is really great to have some sort of intergroup cooperation and some common goals involved when you're doing intergroup contact as opposed to competition, because those are things that are going to help create this debiasing situation. Another one is taking the perspective of others. Has really been found to increase positive evaluations of others and decrease the expression of stereotypes. So for example, one race-focused study that's out there found this debiasing technique and said that when you took the perspective of others, it yielded more favorable automatic interracial evaluations of others. And the final one that I really like to bring up is counterstereotypical exemplars. Studies have shown that if you expose people to individuals that contradict widely held stereotypes, that this can help and serve as a debiasing mechanism. So whether we're thinking of, on the left, the elderly marathon runner, or we're thinking of male elementary school teacher, a female scientist, what have you, the more that we're exposed to these kind of counter-stereotypical people, these counter-stereotypical images, these exemplars really can become more chronically accessible and give us those opportunities that we need to override some of our pre-existing biases. So a couple final points here as I close out. I want to make the point here that unconscious associations really truly, as I've kind of said earlier, it's central to how our minds operate. And this is something that's true of all of our minds. When we talk about implicit biases, we're not talking about character flaws. We're talking about you as a human being and how your mind functions. It's really about recognizing the life experiences that you have and how they may shape your perceptions of others in ways that you may or may not consciously desire. But having these implicit biases is just central to our humanity. It's central to how our minds work, regardless of how well-intentioned we are. And the final point there at the bottom is talking about how building new associations is a process, and it takes intention, attention, and time. This is not something that happens overnight. This is not something that certainly happens in the course of a webinar. But when we think about these new associations, it really involves the desire to do so, spending that competent energy to be attentive to the situation, and then repetition and exposure over time. Again, if you think back to that Stroop test with the two different colored columns that we used earlier, you can imagine that if you really had the intention, the attention, and time to reprogram those associations, that right-hand column ultimately could become much easier and could become a new association if you chose to do so. I just want to close out here on a quote that I really enjoy. It's from Dr. Nancy Hopkins, and she did it at she spoke it at May 2014 commencement baccalaureate address at Boston University. It really puts this in context. And she says, you know, if you ask me to name the greatest discoveries of the past 50 years, alongside things like the internet and the Higgs particle, I would include the discovery of unconscious biases and the extent to which stereotypes about gender, race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and age deprive people of equal opportunity in the workplace and equal justice in society. Again, it's very much about this big picture. It's not just about what's going on in our minds, but it's about the ramifications that occur. And finally, if any of this is interest to you at all, I do want to spend one moment with a book recommendation. It's a book called Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. It was put out almost 2 years ago now by two of the biggest names in the field of implicit associations, Azreen Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. It's a super readable book. It's kind of similar if you're familiar with, I'm drawing a blank on his name now, Malcolm Gladwell. Some of his books that provide really great science. It's really, really true to the academic work, but at the same time it's super readable, super accessible. Blind Spot falls in the same category, and it would be a recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl. We do have a few questions. I think this is a lot of information to absorb with our conscious brains. Thinking about child welfare in particular in government systems and reliance, it's pretty clear that probably all the factors you mentioned around time constraints, high cognitive needs, fatigue, are characteristic of most public systems that are underfunded and under-resourced. So as we think about ways in which we can bring implicit bias to light in the work in government agencies, there may be layers of things I'm going to ask as possibilities, but obviously if we could have lower caseloads and more time for people to do the work they do, that will help to mitigate some of the implicit bias. Being aware of implicit bias as a factor in decision making is important. But also might things in the work environment and messaging that comes out, if it was structured in a way to counteract some of the associations that cause us to have more biases and stereotypes, be helpful?
Well, absolutely. I mean, anytime, as I said, anytime we're exposed to those new or different messages, even if we don't necessarily realize it, it's starting to, you know, we're absorbing those messages in the same way that we're absorbing the other messages that we've done throughout the course of our lifetime. So anytime, even just if you're thinking of it in terms of organization, the images you put on a website, the images you put on brochures or whatnot. These things really seem quite simple, but they can have a tremendous impact. To give you a more concrete example of this, there's a judge in Iowa, he's a district court judge named Mark Bennett, and he really has taken on this implicit bias knowledge in tremendous amount in terms of his courtroom and his court dynamics. He's been really cognizant about the images that are up in the courtroom, trying to make sure that they are not in any way reinforcing some of those biases, but instead people that walk through the hallways of his courtroom and court building are instead being exposed to these new or different images, creating those kind of opportunities for new associations. Similarly, he actually educates all of his prospective jurors on implicit associations and implicit biases before they ever have the opportunity to sit on a jury in his courtroom. That education piece really truly is key. I know that resources are strapped, I know that time is short, but it's one of those things that when you have the knowledge base, you really can start to assess your organization and understand the different places perhaps where implicit biases are showing up, and it's that awareness and education and knowledge that provides the foundational step for change and movement forward. So in Judge Bennett's courtroom, he's providing this education to his prospective jurors, and he's putting messaging on the walls and whatnot, and really creating an environment as much as possible, because he does not want these implicit biases that people carry around with them affecting the judgments that they provide. And so he's trying to create the environment through that subtle ways that perhaps people don't necessarily consciously notice, but nevertheless those messages are certainly infiltrating their minds, and certainly he would hope that that affects the judicial outcomes as well, even though it's a relatively subtle process.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think that what you have presented, highlights how much media, social networking, and everything else continues to impact our implicit bias.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
In some ways, things have evolved in a positive way, perhaps, around LGBT people through more images of non-stereotypical individuals, of TV shows, certainly most recently the president mentioning transgender for the first time in a State of the Union address, TV shows with transgender characters, that sort of thing happening. Those kinds of things should be impacting, hopefully, at least some people in terms of their biases. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
okay.
And certainly it's something that we may not see instantaneous results on, but again, it's a matter of consistency over time. As those messages continue to ingrain themselves in our mind, the more we see them, the more we're exposed to them. And the media is such a powerful source. It's a tremendous opportunity, and it certainly has a potential for a lot of positive impacts in the same way that it has potential for a lot of negative impacts. But you're right, in terms of the growth of social media and the images that we see, I would say, generally speaking, we're potentially on a very positive trajectory when it comes to the images and representations we see of LGBT individuals.
In thinking in terms of training direct service workers who work with young people and hopefully can have the kinds of conversations and provide the supports they need for healthy development and also to understand their own identity development and how they view themselves, do you think there are things folks can do in addition to the traditional training to do skill building around positively using this kind of information around implicit bias in the field of direct service?
Well, absolutely. And I think the point I would want to raise there is that it needs to be for all individuals. So for example, just because you're working with LGBT youth and you want to talk about the messaging they're receiving and how they're portraying and understanding and internalizing these messages in themselves, it's one thing, and it's a super positive thing to be able to, if you can make that more positive, the associations that they're carrying with them as positive as possible, that's great. But at the same time, there needs to be more education at the same time for individuals and youth that are not LGBT, helping them understand some of the associations that they carry as well. So it really kind of is one of those things where, same thing for males and females, you could create a group for females and have them have very strong leadership implicit associations about themselves. But at the same time, if males, their counterparts, don't have their messages also reprogrammed at the same time, it's not going to be as effective. So when we think about identity development and changing these messages, I want to make sure that we don't think of it as a super narrow task, but really thinking about it in terms of how these messages need to change regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of your gender identity, so on and so forth.
So another question, both in our work, both around race equity, around sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, around all the kinds of things we try to do to have courageous conversations to help move our work forward in a positive way. Our experience has often been that people sometimes shut down, they're silent, they don't engage, and perhaps are not as candid about things because we think it's not politically correct or whatever. Do you think in trying to frame courageous conversations as a way to improve systems that there is a way to introduce the idea of implicit bias as a preparation for folks that might help to facilitate more authentic conversations around these issues?
I do think so, and I strategically kind of designed my presentation today in a specific way as well that aligns with this, and the fact that the brain science part really is a critical piece to it, helping people understand the System 1 and System 2, and helping them understand this is not a character flaw. This is part of how our minds work and whatnot. And you feel like it kind of opens the door. So if you're going to talk about issues related to bias or issues that really are sensitive on a social level, when you have this, starting with this premise of saying, you know what, we have this consciousness, but we also have this unconsciousness, and really building it out from that, I've found in my work that it really opens a lot of doors. It gets people away from that defensive, like, what, you're telling me I'm biased? We're talking about bias. We're talking about, you know, whatever issue it is that's particularly socially sensitive. But instead take that step back and talk about how the mind works and talk about how these associations came to be. It really kind of creates that space and say, all right, they're not accusing me of being biased. They're not accusing me of holding these explicit biases. But hey, it's possible these implicit biases do have an effect on me. So I really truly subscribe to this notion, kind of what I modeled here a little bit today, talking about the different systems of your mind and how your mind works, and using that as a stepping stone into some of those conversations that are more difficult. I've certainly found it pretty effective in some of the work that we do. So that would be kind of the first thought that comes to mind in terms of a suggestion, is thinking about some of these unconscious dynamics and using that as an easier way into some conversations that might truly be particularly challenging to hold, but yet nevertheless very important.
That's very helpful. Because we're always talking about creating a safe space, and maybe it's creating a more authentic space where we totally understand how our brains work and work from there in the conversations we have, maybe a little more comfortably. There's one more question that we have. What was the name of the author of this concept? Daniel something? Somebody
Yes.
didn't catch the name of the author.
So the book is called Thinking Fast and Slow, and his name is Daniel Kahneman, K-A-H-N-E-M-A-N.
Okay, and that we will be sending out the slideshow to participants after this. It is a recorded webinar. It will be on our website at getrealnetwork.uic.edu, and we will send it out as well, the link for the recorded version to our network members. Cheryl, thanks so much for this. This is a lot of information to absorb and has been really, really insightful and helpful.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay.